Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com. And this week I am so happy to introduce a very special guest on the show. Today we have with us Dr. Sumita Bhatta, who is the Vice President and Global Development Therapeutic Head of Rare Disease at Amgen. Dr. Bhatta is a board-certified medical oncologist with over a decade of experience in the biopharmaceutical industry with multiple roles in research and development. Dr. Bhatta received her undergraduate degree from UCLA and received both an MS in Applied Physiology and an MD from the Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science in Chicago, Illinois. She completed her internal medicine residency, hematology oncology fellowship, as well as a clinical pharmacology pharmacogenomics fellowship at the University of Chicago. Dr. Bhatta is dual boarded in medical oncology and clinical pharmacology. So to learn more about the very dynamic, evolving landscape of rare diseases, which we are always so happy and very focused on covering here at Xtalks, so I'm very especially excited to have Dr. Bhatta on the show to really speak about the space currently. Let's turn to Dr. Bhatta now. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Ayesha, for having me. This is such a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you so much for your time. And as I mentioned, the space of rare diseases has really come a long way, and I'd really love to get your thoughts on that in just a bit, of course, and as the conversation progresses. But I'd first like to get to know more about your path into rare disease drug development personally and professionally, and what really drew you to this space.
Yeah, awesome. So as you had mentioned, my training in fellowship and beyond had really been in oncology. And when I joined Amgen, I joined the oncology side of the house, largely doing roles in both global development, medical affairs, and more asset management as time went on. As you may know, Amgen has recently acquired a company called Horizon, which came with a portfolio of rare disease assets. And as you also may know, oncology actually has a lot of rare disease development in it. And Amgen had been no stranger to that over several years. So when the opportunity came to lead the Horizon asset profile and global development, it was a perfect fit for many reasons, not only for me, but for Amgen in general. Amgen has largely been committed to developing drugs in areas of high unmet need with large effect sizes. And the portfolio of drugs and indications that came with the Horizon acquisition really fit that ethos quite well. So it was really an honor to be able to jump into another therapeutic area, continue to grow and develop both personally and professionally, but also utilize, potentially some of the learnings from the oncology space to try to guide and develop in rare disease as well.
Indeed. And I think there is a lot of overlap and a lot of learnings, as you mentioned. A lot of diseases and indications in oncology are rare diseases. And so you definitely have that overlap. And so thank you so much for sharing that journey. And so today, Dr. Bhatta, what does your role as Global Development Therapeutic Head of Rare Disease at Amgen entail? And that seems like it's a mouthful, but I'm sure the job itself is even bigger than the words itself. So we'd love to hear about how you manage everything and what exactly your day entails and what you have under your umbrella.
We're actively looking to continue our leadership in this space with the development of new assets that are more homegrown or potentially come from in-licensing opportunities. And with that, I lead a team of scientists and medical researchers who are involved in clinical trial design and execution. A large proportion of them have experience with regulators around the world, understanding what the development process needs to be, and have developed skills in innovating across diseases so that we can really develop new ways of developing drugs within the rare disease space.
What factors drive your strategic focus on rare diseases, since it is a very complex, of course, area, various indications, even within a particular disease area? And so, how do you really identify opportunities within this very challenging area?
The identification of opportunities hinges on both internal expertise, but largely is reliant on our external experts. So, we have multiple conversations with opinion leaders, with patient advocacy groups, with patients themselves, trying to understand what are the diseases that they're afflicted with, what was their journey like, are there other potential ways in which we can target these diseases? And the expertise that we have within Amgen from a biology point of view is quite extensive. Essentially, we are modality agnostic. We have expertise across small molecules, monoclonal antibodies, all types of therapies, but we also have deep expertise in understanding disease biology and potential targets. So when we marry the list of rare diseases that exist and where we understand the biology best, we're able to come up with some potentials for future development. Um, it doesn't end there, though. I think we aren't married to just what we think we can do. We're also very opportunistic in listening to what what the needs are within the communities and what drugs may exist externally as well. And so it's a little bit of it's not as rigid or focused a path as potentially some of the other indications we pursue within other disease areas. There's a lot of flexibility and agility needed in identifying rare disease targets. And that comes with a lot of conversations, a lot of education from external folks, as well as our internal expertise with what we think we can do best.
And in terms of really challenges in early diagnosis for rare diseases, which is, of course, a very, as I mentioned, a very significant challenge. What types of initiatives or approaches do you believe could improve awareness and then ultimately lead to timely intervention?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. We hear from so many patients with rare diseases that their journey was not straightforward in terms of their diagnosis. They spent multiple years, receiving different diagnoses, maybe different therapies with no true, abatement of their symptoms or change in the biology of their disease, no real disease modification. And so the challenge is real. And I think the ultimate solution is finding a therapy that works. Once a therapy becomes available, then diseases get diagnosed more quickly. And you actually grow the prevalence of the disease just because of knowledge and awareness of a drug that works. But before that can happen, there just needs to be a ton of education and partnership. Again, that involves, partnership with opinion leaders who are experts in the space. Oftentimes, there are very tight, close knit patient organizations and advocacy organizations who have dedicated so much of their time and energy to these diseases that they are absolutely critical to spreading the word and creating that education for the community so that there's awareness of the disease in general.
Indeed. And speaking about really those different stakeholders, patients and their caregivers being one of the main ones, how important are those partnerships, which you said definitely are, but in terms of the nature of partnerships, what types of collaborations does your team lead with, let's say, academic institutions, other industry stakeholders, and of course, your approach to striking those partnerships with patients and patient advocacy groups?
I think a very beautiful example of this that I can highlight is with the development of our drug Uplizna in IgG4 related disease. This is a disease that is often considered the great mimicker because of the way that it presents and mimics oftentimes cancers and other rheumatologic illnesses. It's a disease that impacts multiple organs, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes synchronously in a body, and is a very challenging diagnosis for patients. With that said, there hadn't really even been an ICD-10 code for this disease until fairly recently. So when we initiated our study, which we call Mitigate, in this disease, it required a bunch of firsts. It required the definition of an endpoint being established. It required once we realized that the endpoint would be reduction in flares, we needed to define what flares were. So it required, creating that definition as well, and then creating the rules for the adjudication committee to be able to decide whether a patient had a flare or not. It required getting buy-in from regulators across the globe, and then it required finding the patients. And none of this could have been done without the collaboration between the physicians who were passionate about this disease, who had known the most about it, and were able to tell us what's important in this disease. And none of this could have been done without the patients and the patient advocates, who then spread the word about the trials and helped us with accrual and helped us understand what was most important for patients in general. So I think that's a really nice example of how the community had to come together in order to create and pave a path for something that hadn't yet been established.
Absolutely. And I think it's really testament to how far the field has come. And a large part has been driven by patients themselves, if you look at it in rare diseases. And that's, really serving as a model perhaps for other disease areas as well, for patients to really not hesitate to come forward, share their stories, and be part of these patient advocacy groups that can really drive meaningful, tangible change, not just on the awareness front, which is, I think, traditionally where these groups have been, but to really drive innovations in medicines and drug development as well. So that's been really great and really kind of cool to see, I guess, in the past decade or so, with like things like the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge and all of those things that we've seen. And in your opinion, I'm just talking about these things, but as an expert in the field who's seen it evolve firsthand, what have been some of the most exciting things and advancements that you've seen in, let's say, the last decade or so? And where are we today in rare diseases, in your opinion?
I think we've grown, and I think that the interest is only growing. I mean, I'd be remiss not to mention that Mitigate trial led to a recent approval just a couple of weeks ago for now this disease and an indication where there had been no approved therapies.
Yeah. And congratulations on that. That's huge.
Yeah, thank you. But this will lead to more awareness for patients, right? This is where I think the biggest impact will be, is that not only will patients who suffer with the disease have an option, but will allow those who are on that really circuitous journey of diagnosis to perhaps get a quicker diagnosis and be treated, with the right kinds of therapies earlier on in their life. That would be a huge benefit, in my mind, to all of the work and efforts that went into the development of that program. It is without a doubt, there has been gene therapies that have advanced in the rare disease space that have created very promising therapeutic options for patients moving forward. Certainly, there are pockets of diseases that now have greater awareness because of the development and the tenacity of the drug developers in moving therapeutics forward. There's certainly also been a lot of failure, and that comes with drug development in general. I think that that's just par for the course. But I think as the field evolves, the more we continue to focus on these diseases where there's really no options, and we try to bring meaningful therapeutics to these diseases, rare disease in and of itself will have a larger and larger focus. I'm curious on your opinion as well, because I know that you are in this space and you're, very dedicated to it as well. So I mean, I would love to hear what you've observed as you've been running this program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, for that, but indeed, we cover a lot of drug approvals and the latest what's happening in industry, and really seeing a plethora of approvals in the rare disease space. I think especially since COVID, because I think that really showed us that on the regulatory end, how drugs can be approved you have accelerated pathways, and then you also have pathways for rare disease drugs as well. And so I think the pandemic really allowed for the rare disease to kind of open up in a way. And we can even look at COVID as a type of rare disease in the beginning, at least, before it became pandemic status, just in terms of all of the unknowns around it. And I think that really opened up people's eyes in the industry, on the regulatory side, on the drug development side, in terms of like what can happen. And so since COVID, I think, I've covered so many rare disease approvals. It's just been, I think, a record number just like a year or two ago. And it's been really amazing to see. And of course, a lot of those on the cell and gene therapy side in that particular space. And so that space has also blossomed in terms of the innovations that I remember studying in school as proof of concept of a gene therapy and how it could be used. But then to really see that come to fruition in rare diseases, particularly, I think that's just been that evolution's been very quick and very, very, very fruitful. And also speaking with advocacy groups as well for pieces here at Xtalks. And it's just been so game changing. And I think just seeing that evolution from when I was a student with the ALS challenge, as I mentioned, and then now in the industry setting, and to see how far things have come, it's just been, it's been amazing to see. So.
Yeah. And as we get more successes, it'll just become more attractive.
Yes.
To be in the face.
And I do remember, of course, I want to get your opinion on this, of course, from an industry perspective. It used to be that big pharma, and of course, smaller biotechs would not really be investing in rare diseases. I think we did discuss this in terms of the challenges in rare disease drug development. Are there any kind of specific hurdles that you've encountered in advancing treatments for rare diseases, and how do you overcome those kinds of hiccups and things of that nature?
I think patient recruitment is a hurdle because of lack of awareness of the studies, lack of awareness of the disease. And education is a very strong, instrument that we can use to try to improve on these things. But it's hard to get broadly distributed education in a timely fashion. So we are realizing that you need a whole community to even help you with patient recruitment vendors. Sometimes you need a referral network, understanding of a referral network. You need a large hands-on approach, to help with the relationships and with patient navigation, essentially, in order to improve recruitment. And then you also need, on top of that, multiple forms of education, in person, digital, through social media, et cetera, to really get the message across. And so in my oncology experience, this wasn't the hugest element of clinical trial conduct. This wasn't the largest thing that we put our mind and energy into. But now that I've moved into rare disease, it's definitely a large focus. How do we actually accrue patients to these trials in an expeditious manner such that a therapy can become available expeditiously as well?
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the clinical trial aspect in the drug development process and journey, really trajectory, what kinds of trends really are driving rare disease trials right now? I hate to use the word trend because it's just, but in terms of like we hear about patient-centricity or diversity, but how does that really play out, and what are the approaches to really fostering those elements within clinical trials? And I think those are especially important elements, of course, in rare disease trials.
Yeah, the diversity question is a very interesting one, right? Especially when your patient pool is so small.
Yeah.
You still want to have diverse
Representation.
Yeah, absolutely. Within the clinical trials, it is not easy. It requires, I think, navigating and finding the right groups that can help with the accrual of those patients. It's called RISE, but it's really representation in clinical research, and it it focuses exactly on this question. So not only in broad diseases like our cardiovascular diseases or in our obesity profile, how do we actually encourage diverse representation in our clinical trials in these smaller settings as well? So with this dedicated group, with our relationships with advocacy organizations and specific OLs, we're able to reach those patients more efficiently. And we were able to do so particularly in thyroid eye disease, for instance. When that drug was being developed, we were able to create a consortium of physicians who could help us understand where to find those patients and have them accrued.
And in terms of, I think we touched on this, the challenges in rare disease research in terms of small patient populations. How do you see real world evidence complementing traditional research methods and approaches in the rare disease space?
I think real world evidence is hugely important in this space, particularly. And we saw some of this playing out even in the oncology space with some of the rare indications where real world evidence can not only provide you with information that helps design your clinical trial, it can also, in some cases, if done properly, serve as a control surrogate, right? And so I think, building the infrastructure for real world evidence in rare disease is something that still has room for, I think, improvement as we move forward. And I've seen it very nicely done with oncology, where there are real world databases set up and you just have to go pick and choose what your inclusion criteria are, and then you have a host of information about that type of population and how they would naturally what the natural course of their disease might be and what the natural treatments are that they would get. And I think that's a great opportunity for rare disease as well, as we start identifying more patients, to create registries or to have other mechanisms by which we can continue to follow them longitudinally.
Mhm. And in terms of, I would say, emerging trends and technologies, what do you think is going to be really a factor that might redefine this space, the rare disease space, both from diagnosis through to treatment and also awareness and management over the next couple of years? What kinds of things are you seeing and looking forward to, and are you predicting will really be game changing in this space?
So I know that AI is the buzzword, but it's
Yeah.
a legitimate buzzword
A
for I think
legitimate
for
buzzword. I like that.
yeah, it's going to be critically important for rare disease in the sense that, with AI, we can find pockets of where patients exist. We can help with enrollment in clinical trials. We can understand natural history of disease, and AI will even help ultimately in the diagnoses, I believe, of some of these rare diseases. So I am excited to see what AI does beyond even what I can imagine it's capable of doing. And I think a large benefit will actually be for those patients with rare diseases, because mainstream thinking may not easily address diagnosis and treatment for some of these patients, but AI, with the proper algorithms, very much could.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, yeah, we kind of do fall into the trap of thinking it's a buzzword because, it's all about the application and really knowing where to apply it appropriately. And yeah, I think in terms of from clinical trials or even before from diagnoses to clinical trials, I think we're seeing that's already really game changing in terms of identifying patients and the right patients and really. So, as a leader in global development, what do you consider the most critical elements for fostering innovation and driving change in the rare disease sector? So, that's the formal question. But in terms of global development, what kind of elements are at play when you look at different regions, region-specific challenges, and things of that nature?
I think ultimately you have to have a um, good foundational understanding of disease biology and of the development path. And then you have to take the regional differences into consideration when developing your comprehensive clinical development program. And again, I think the benefit of being at a company like Amgen is that they've been globally focused for, decades at this point where there's, an understood geographic footprint where we typically develop drugs and have a good understanding of the, regulatory needs as well as the patient specific needs in many of these locations. So my role is to oversee this process, particularly as drugs come in from, phase one through approval. And I think that it's not as complex just because of the experience that we've had over multiple diseases, but it is different with rare because the geographic footprint may need to be different than our typical standard therapeutic areas that we have worked with so far. When the patients are so challenging to find, you got to scour the globe essentially. And with this will come new learnings about different populations in different regions. And that's what just makes it so exciting.
And from a clinical development perspective, what are sort of the elements driving or important or integral to multi-center, trials and conducting those? It's not an easy feat, and I know, of course, Amgen is well equipped and well resourced, but in terms of really building those efficiencies and building those robust trials and that robust clinical development program, what goes into developing multi-center trials?
I think what you might be getting at is how do you select, the appropriate sites that should be
Sites, yeah,
participating in your
yeah.
trials? And we actually have machine learning that helps us to determine, how many patients do these particular sites see, how frequently. It gives you a sense of what their familiarity is with the disease and with the patients, and how many times have we included these sites in our clinical trials? Do we already have relationships, et cetera? That helps us determine the site footprint when we start creating a new clinical trial. This machine learning that we have developed at Amgen takes into consideration, just a lot of data that's been accrued over the years to help us with making decisions as we move forward. This will, of course, need to be, what's the word that I'm looking for? This needs to be enhanced with data from rarer populations, and that will happen over time as we continue to do clinical studies in these various diseases. But I think we look to see where there's been volume, where there's expertise, where there's interest, and where we can get diverse representation across the globe when we start thinking about how to accrue our sites for our clinical studies.
And from a regulatory standpoint, how have things changed or maybe not changed so much, or what would you like to see change in that regard or on that front?
I think that the example with Uplizna and Mitigate is such a great example of the partnerships with, regulatory agencies, with a company, with physicians, truly trying to represent what patients need. That was true innovation happening on the fly. I think that regulators are open to that when it's reasonable, when it's practical, when the unmet need is high. So I just look forward to finding and paving paths like that for other diseases as we move forward.
Mhm. And what advice would you have for someone that is looking to get into the rare disease space and really balancing innovation with unmet needs and just everything that goes into rare disease drug development and the whole process, the patient journey and all of that? So what kind of advice would you have, whether it's a burgeoning entrepreneur at a smaller biotech or somebody who is looking to step into industry and really follow the footsteps of leaders like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I must admit, I love what I'm doing, but even I could learn from burgeoning entrepreneurs. But what I would say from my experience is it's unconstrained thinking. It's not having a roadmap in advance, as we typically have in some of our other therapeutic areas. It's really outside of the box ideation, and then pressure testing whether or not it's truly impossible to go that way versus the other way of moving forward, which would be, having a slightly more constrained view of thinking and asking yourself, how can I make it happen? So I think it's really sort of being more agile and broad in your frame of thinking when addressing which indications to pursue in which populations, in which time frame.
Mhm. And indeed, those are the tough decisions that we are so happy to learn, that leaders like yourself are at the helm of really making those decisions, leading to those innovations and those very important treatments for rare diseases, and in many cases where there are no treatments or limited treatment options. And so, Dr. Bhatta, thank you so much for everything that you do. It is truly remarkable, and I wish you all the best in all of your endeavors, and looking forward to really keeping an eye out on everything that you're leading at Amgen. And once again, thank you so much for all of your work and for your time for our Xtalks episode today.
Ayesha, what a delight this was. Thank you for having me. Look forward to connecting with you again, which I'm sure will happen in the future. So thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Absolutely.
And thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.